Hi, I'm Rand Hoppy. I'm greeting you from this fantastic Jack Kirby collage.
He's in space.
I'm the executive director of the Kirby Museum. Who are you guys, anyhow?
I'm Tom Kraft. I'm the president of the Jack Kirby Museum.
And I'm Mike Cicchini, the secretary of the Jack Kirby Museum.
And me, or should somebody else talk about me?
And we are with
Who are you?
Who are you? Who am me?
Yeah.
My name is Abraham Riesman. I'm a journalist, and I've written a book called True Believer: The Rise and Fall of Stan Lee, which was supposed to come out next month, and due to greater world events that are out of my control, it will now be coming out on February 16th. But I promise it'll be like a fine wine with the age,
Yes.
the initial date, and when it actually comes out, it'll be even better. But anyway, yes, that's and I'm broadcasting to you live from Providence, Rhode Island, where I reside.
Fantastic. So you have the Stan Lee book. So here they are, these two troublemakers.
Grinning, happy as clams, I know. Yeah, these, I'll apologize in advance. I'm not a great slide and deck creator, so this might not be the most interesting slideshow that anyone's ever seen, but I picked, and there's my cat.
Yay!
Hi, Barb.
What's the name of the cat?
That's Barbara, and the other cat that I got at the same time is Tim. And any true Batman fan will understand why I did that.
Okay.
Tim and Barbara, but Barb, stop wandering around there. Anyway, okay, so I didn't create the most advanced slideshow, but I thought I would talk a little bit about Jack kind of as an object of study in the context of the book research.
Right.
And that what you see right there is Stan and Jack in, I believe, 1965, and then them again in 1986, I believe, is when that photo was taken.
Cool.
Do you want me to just do a spiel, or do you guys want to ask me questions?
We'll get in when we feel we have something to say, but just keep rocking, and then we'll pop in. Yep.
I can do that. So the book isn't about Jack, but without Jack, there is no book. There's a lot of the Stan Lee story that, not like I have to tell anybody who's watching this live stream, is completely unimaginable without the presence of Jacob Kurtzberg. There's so much in Stan's life that is central, that emerges from his relationship with Jack Kirby. So, I had done a fair amount of research into Jack in the past for various articles, because if you're like me, somebody who writes about the comic book industry, which I did at Vulture, the culture site of New York Magazine for about 6.5 years, when you do that, a lot of stories end up involving Jack. No matter who you're writing about, if it is in the comics industry, there's a good chance that at some point this person will have either been inspired by Jack, or if they were contemporaries, will have intersected with Jack.
Right.
And it was really interesting to be able to take what I'd learned in bits and pieces from throughout all of those articles over the course of the years when I was writing about this stuff, and kind of see how those dots connected. Because, I had written a profile of Stan that was published in 2016. It was more like a reported essay, but it was, a long reported piece that came out then. And obviously I had to learn a lot about Jack for that. I wrote a piece about the Fourth World. It was initially going to be sort of a broader profile of Jack, timed to his 100th birthday, but it didn't work out that way with the timing, so it ended up being pegged to Justice League, everybody's favorite movie, the initial release of Justice League, because Justice League has Steppenwolf in it. So okay, here we go. This is the excuse to play.
Yeah, I know.
It's a weird one, though. It's not
it's not the finest example of Kirby's work being adapted. but it gave me an excuse to write a sort of deep dive into the fourth world. And then, there's all kinds of miscellaneous other pieces that had happened. So when I sat down to write Stan's story, I did my best to consume as much as I could about Jack's story, which, I'll fully confess, this is not a biography of Jack Kirby, so there's a lot of stuff I don't know. If there's a quiz portion of this broadcast, I may well fail. But, one thing that was particularly interesting for me to think about, this is just sort of a random tangent when I think about the two of them, is the similarities and differences of their upbringings as Jews in New York City, as children of immigrants in Jewish New York. Yep. And then how that affects their trajectory throughout the entire rest of their lives. I'm Jewish, and I spend a lot of time thinking about Jewish issues, and I also write about them, and, it's part of my professional life, blah, blah, blah. So when I wanted to write this book, I was like, you can't really totally understand someone unless you understand the sort of generational BS that got passed down from what preceded them. But also, it was like, somebody's paying me to do some research. I can get away with doing this thing that I find interesting. So looking at all that, one thing that becomes really clear is Jack was somebody who really felt, even though he was not an Orthodox Jew, he felt very passionately that he was a Jew and that was something that was important to him. Mm-hmm. And, I was talking to Mark Evanier, who everybody I'm sure on this stream knows who Evanier is, but, biographer and close friend and assistant to Jack. You okay? Sorry, my partner is trying to build a lamp in the other room.
Okay. Wow.
Sorry, there's a lot going on.
There's a lot going on
right now. I really apologize. But Evanier told me that, and you may already know about this, that Jack did costumes for a Purim spiel that was happening in Los Angeles area synagogue at some point. I hadn't known that, but it's such an interesting thing because the idea of Stan doing something that was remotely Jewish in an explicit way, or like something in partnership with the synagogue. Yeah. Say what you will about Stan or Jack, none of this is like moral evaluation, but just the contrast is so stark. There's no way Stan would have ever gotten involved in anything like that. He walked away from Jewishness in this very purposeful way, which again, I'm not judging that. It's very interesting to see the way that these two guys who come from a similar milieu end up, for various reasons of nature and nurture, having this sort of divergence point on at least that aspect of their identities. But plenty of other aspects, obviously, not like we have any shortage of divergences between the personalities of Stan and Jack. But, one thing that I found interesting was while I was looking into all the times that Jack talked about Stan, which he did a fair amount, especially in the latter years of his life. I was really surprised to find that around the end, Jack had this kind of interesting resignation to a certain degree about Stan. I'm sort of jumping here to the end after I'm talking about the beginning, but the next slide in there, if you want to go to the next slide, is I believe I did this right. Is this quote? There was this, 86 when that photo was taken. This convention goer, whose name is now escaping me, but just sort of a guy who was out there, got a quote from Jack at this comics convention in 1986, where he says he'd taken this picture of the two of them, and then, oh my God, am I mixing up two cons? Oh God, I'm sorry. I finished the book this is what they don't tell you about books. I've already started researching my next book, so I might be conflating two Comic-Cons.
Sure.
Disclaimer. But the point was, Jack gave this quote that I feel like really encapsulates a lot of what he was talking about at the end of his life when it came to Stan, which is, I can understand why there's struggle over who did what, because Stan and I know. Nobody else knows. If Stan would only come out of his hiding place and tell the world, everything would go great. It isn't obscure. He knows it, and I know it. There won't be a resolution. People don't change. They can't change. Sometimes it's too late. You just go on being what you are. Human beings go on being human beings. I can predict everything that Stan will do. I know I can't change Stan. He says his piece and I say mine. I could shake hands with Stan till doomsday and it would resolve nothing. The dance goes on.
Wow.
What a quote, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know. Coming across that one, I was just blown away, especially because Stan told people that his last interaction with Jack was them meeting up at a con and saying, and Jack, giving Stan a hug and or shaking his hand and saying, you have nothing to reproach yourself about, Stan.
Right.
And Evanier told me very firmly, like, that didn't happen. There's no chance that would have happened. And when you look at the evidence, you can see, sure, they might smile next to each other in a photo, but like the idea that it just seems inconceivable to me that Jack, then again, who knows, but that he would just say to Stan, you're forgiven. You don't have anything to worry about. Like, it seems more like if he'd said anything to him, it would probably be something closer to like, well, I mean, I don't want to speculate, but it'd be something closer to the statement that you're seeing here, which is, maybe it was saying like, it is what it is, but the idea that he would forgive Stan seemed very dubious to me, at least. I wanted to, in the book, kind of dispel some of the preconceptions that a lot of people have about, not just, the whole Stan and Jack relationship, but particularly about the final years of it, where I think there's a lot of people want there to be a happy ending.
Yeah.
So when you see documentaries or read articles or, read certain books, a lot of times they sort of try to say, and then Stan and Jack saw each other at a party or they saw each other at a con.
Yeah.
And they shook hands and they said, we did a great job back in the day. And they, that was it. And that was their last interaction. Now, I wasn't there. It may well be that was their final interaction. There's a lot of tall tales and conflicting stories when it comes to Stan and Jack from a lot of different people who are talking about it over the years. But I don't know. It's a place where I wanted to try and at least introduce different voices that hadn't been heard before, and say, maybe we don't know as much as we think we know.
Yeah.
About their relationship. So, I guess we can also talk a little bit about like my relationship with Jack Kirby as an artist. I don't want to sound too impartial because, it's like, but the trouble is when you are interested in comics, why don't you go to the next slide?
Oh, sure. Sorry. Yep.
You don't mind. No, that's fine.
Yep. Of course.
So this is kind of a random thing that I pulled, but we'll talk about it in a second, but I just wanted to have some art up there.
Right.
It's interesting. While within the comics world, not like I have to tell you guys, there's a lot of partisanship about Stan and Jack. And I want to make clear that I have no dog in that fight. I am not part of that battle. I wanted to be as impartial a juror as I could be. Does that mean I don't have any relationship with the art and the creative works that both Stan and Jack produced? Mostly the ones they produced together, but to a certain degree, ones they produced separately. Of course, because I've read. I am who I am. Like, I grew up reading superhero comics, and although I was growing up long after the heydays of the Lee Kirby partnership, you develop a relationship of some kind with the creations that they put out there, or that one or both of them put out there, that they had some degree of stewardship over. And so that means, since I was very young, I've had some kind of idea about Jack Kirby in my head. And, I'm always learning new things. I guess that'll be my transition to talking about this panel that we're looking, or this
great. Yeah.
spread that we're talking about, which is, I can't remember the exact number of Captain America comics this is from. I'll warn you, I was not a numbers guy throughout my education. So very often issue numbers I am not great at. I
hear you.
But this is an early Simon and Kirby Captain America comics, which is often credited as being the first 2-page spread. And I didn't know about this until I was working on this project at Vulture called 100 Pages That Changed Comics, where we pulled 100, I mean, it's what it sounds like. And sometimes changed comics, we meant a little loosely and would be more like this from a work that changes comics. And this is a panel, a page that really encapsulates it. And a lot of them really were landmarks, like things where people saw them and said, there's a different way to do comics.
Mm-hmm.
And although, the golden age is a hard place to kind of get concrete firsts out of, just because it's so hard to find a complete archive of what was being published in this massive glut of product that was being tossed out back then, especially given that a lot of it was just not, stored anywhere. Yeah. But from what I understand from people who are smarter than me who've done this research, this is an instance of Kirby and Simon just sort of having an idea that now is so commonplace you can't even think of inventing it. It'd be like inventing the color red.
That's right. Yeah.
Like the idea of a 2-page spread, especially one in which you have like, multiple characters from like different parts of the story blended in, and like this sort of, heavy exposition thing where the fact that you had never seen, or at least had very rarely seen, 2 pages of a comic book that were bound together as an image is astounding to me. And that's what I love about learning about Kirby stuff is, beyond the aesthetics, and the aesthetics are wonderful in a lot of cases. I don't think that's partisan to say that. I mean, I don't know if the camera can see, but I have this.
There you go. Hang on.
Is that it?
No, yeah. Let me get there.
Yeah. No. So that's, you can't quite see it with the glare, but that's my Lord of Light black light poster.
Right.
That I got from
Heavy Metal.
Yeah, Heavy Metal printed them, and I got it signed by Geller. What's his name?
Barry Geller, who's actually in the chat.
Oh, he's going to be on the chat?
Yeah, no, he's here right now.
Oh, he is. Oh, no kidding. Hi, Barry. Thank you so much for signing the poster. Yeah, that's funny. It's great. I just moved into this place and needed something to fill this little wall in my home office, and it's been one of my my favorite little prints that I've had for a while. And the point is, when you get into this world, you get a relationship with Kirby stuff, and you also see the way in which this guy who was not classically trained, I mean, he did a few classes here and there, but he was this guy who was not really existing that much in dialogue with previous artists of his ilk, because there weren't that many artists of his ilk. I mean, comic books were not a thing that existed. So a lot of this is just a priori. It's just, or sui generis, I think is what I'm trying to say. Both of them, I think, work kind of. But, they're both, this is a guy who was able to imagine things that didn't exist before. At least, obviously you can have the debate about, who came up with the characters, but just in pure visual sense, I mean, you get instances like this, but then you get like the collage work that he would do later. And just as an object of study, again, not as a partisan, it's fascinating to research anybody who was able to be a pretty clear beginning point of some kind of cultural or artistic or political or whatever phenomenon. Somebody like who is a clear, turning point, landmark, whatever. That's always going to be somebody that you find something interesting to learn about every time. I can't even remember what the next slide is. Do you want to?
Oh, okay, let's find out.
I believe it's really.
There we go.
So, I was thinking when you were asking me to put in stuff for the slides, like what might be the Kirby work that has had the most impact on me. And the thing is, I will confess, I didn't grow up reading these particular comics. They were very hard to find in any kind of aesthetically appealing fashion when it came to the turn of the 90s, which is when I was really getting into comics. But, I knew they were important on some level, but I didn't really read them. And only in adulthood did I really finally actually sit down and just read all this stuff. And I'll be honest that a lot of it I sort of appreciate, but don't really have any kind of deep emotional connection to, which I think helped in terms of writing the book, because I, don't have any kind of preconceived biases or whatever that I might have if I had been more like, living on this stuff when I was at a formative age. But that said, when I was an adult going through Kirby's work, and I finally got to the Galactus saga, I had, heard about it and had, I think, even read like a reprint edition when I was a kid, but like in some crappy black and white thing where like a page was missing at the library.
Right.
I barely remembered any of it.
Yeah.
I'd heard and read so many references to it in the years since that I'd forgotten how weird it is. I mean, the shaving interlude alone is worth the price of admission rather, or intermission. But what really struck me was these two consecutive pages in 49. Fantastic Four 49, I should say. Because they are so I think about them a lot lately, especially because they're very apocalyptic. I mean, it's like, this is an apocalyptic story, the Galactus saga, obviously. And I feel like this is sort of the beating heart of it. And what's interesting is there's no explosions. There's no bloodletting. No one's getting punched. But this is the most anxious you can imagine being if you're reading this superhero comic, which, again, if we want to talk about things that were kind of sui generis, having this kind of big bad, this kind of supervillain in the form of Galactus was something that if you're a kid reading, reading comic books, you'd never seen that before.
Right.
So you have to convey dread in order to really pull that trick off. And God, look at the looks on the faces of the FF in the title page. And what's fascinating is you don't even know what they're looking at in that image. You just know that something's horrific. I mean, maybe it's the 60s. No one was like doing digital uploads or back orders. So maybe you just pick up this comic and you've missed the previous one, and you have no idea who these people are that are talking to each other, but you know who the FF are. And you look at this and you go, something is screwed up. Like, the FF are not supposed to look like that. Reed Richards is not supposed to be unshaven. That alone,
that's right.
Something's up. And then you get to the next page and it's a total payoff. They're not the proportions are slightly off, obviously, like Galactus. Well, maybe that's just because later in the story, Galactus appears much larger, and
right.
But the fact is, you get this. This is one of the rare instances where I feel like you can pretty unequivocally say it's a page that Stan and Jack contributed to equally. Very rare that you can say that, because you have the stunning, dreadful visuals of your heroes dwarfed by what looks like, God talking to a robot that's going to eat God. And at the same time, you get what I personally think is the best line that Stan Lee ever wrote, just from a personal favorite perspective, which is, "Of what import our brief nameless lives to Galactus." I love that line. And so I guess that's just me saying this is probably it's a really basic thing to say, that the Galactus saga is the one that grips you the most when it comes to Kirby in his heyday. But it's a classic for a reason. It's something that I think really holds up. And a lot of the stuff from that era, it's again, you sort of appreciate that it was doing stuff that was not being done before.
Right.
But for me, I was raised with a different sensibility for what comics are supposed to be. And one of the things that was a real interesting challenge of doing the book was talking to a lot of people who were, present and reading when the Marvel Revolution happened in the 60s. People, who had that kind of visceral hunger for more of this material, this kind of sense that either they wanted to never stop reading comics or they wanted to make comics or whatever. It's hard, as somebody who was born even just, a generation or a generation and a half after that, to really understand what that was like. Because it was this cultural phenomenon. It was not just these things sold well. It was something that really moved the needle for a lot of people, both in good ways, both good and bad. I mean, there's the fact that, like, you know, this ended up where are we at now, where like these characters are now bajillion-dollar pieces of IP that the people who actually, you know, make them don't end up having a percentage of, because of the way the comics industry has been built on unjust work for hire laws. You know, so there's negative aspects of how popular Marvel was, in that it got to reinforce a lot of these, you know, practices that I think it's not. One thing I'm always comfortable being a little partisan on is creator rights, just because I feel like if I don't use my voice for that, who else will? And it's not something to really equivocate on. Like if you create something, you should probably have some degree of I'm not a Marxist necessarily for saying you should have some degree of ownership of that. But anyway, you know, you have this whole industry that came out of this few years of creativity, and you can study the people who were making the comics all you like, and trust me, I have.
Yes.
But what you really need is to also understand the people who are receiving it.
Yeah.
You have to understand why, like, what was in the water to the best of your ability, and try and figure out, like, okay, well, why am I writing about this now? Like, why did this thing have such a snowball effect? And it's not always just about the creativity. It is also about the way it's marketed. And, you know, that's the thing where, like, you know, even the most diehard Kirby partisan has to concede to a certain degree that the ugly matter of marketing the stuff was something that, you know, was not Jack's, like, forte. He was not a salesman. That was not something he found any joy in doing. And it is something that Stan did do to great effect. And that actually ended up being more of what I was interested in while I was writing the book. I always feel nervous when I'm imagining doing press events for this, because I'm like, somebody's going to try and say, like, you know, in Fantastic Four number, you know, 93, X happened. Do you remember that? And I'll be like, oh, God. Because I had a limited amount of time to write this book. This is my confession here. I had a limited amount of time to write this book. The publisher wanted it done basically in a year. And that meant I wasn't going to have time to read every comic that Stan Lee had anything to do with. I basically had two options. I can either be as completist as I can about the produced material, or I can be as completist as I can about the stuff that happened in Stan's life, and, you know, the events and beats of that. And I figured, you know, there's been plenty of writing about the material itself, and it's better than I'll ever write about the material itself, because I have not read all of it and don't have the same kind of encyclopedic knowledge of it. But you know, I tried my best to try and look at it from a perspective of, like, these stories are great, but the real story is what I'm here for. Like, the real story is what I'm getting paid for, and what I find interesting. And you know, I forgot where I was going with that point. I'm sort of rambling here. I'm drawing on my skills as a when I was in high school. I was an impromptu and extemporaneous speaker in competitive public speaking. So getting up and, like, riffing for a long while without sufficient preparation is one of my specialties. So
All right.
But I do sometimes go off on tangents. So you want to see what the next slide is, maybe?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
I'm trying to think. I can't remember what it was. Oh, yeah. So writing, you know, moving away from the Stan and Jack relationship a little bit and talking a little bit about the Fourth World, it's really fast, just because I wrote that article about it, so it's something I've thought about a fair amount. You know, it really is remarkable the degree to which we discount Kirby as a writer of dialogue. I've never quite understood. I mean, again, maybe this was one of those things where I had to be there and had to have gotten so used to Stan's dialogue that then when I was seeing Jack's art paired with Jack's words, it was too jarring and it didn't process for me. But, you know, when you look at, like, this page, and you see Darkseid and Glorious Godfrey having this conversation, I mean, good Lord, I am the revelation, the Tiger Force at the core of all things. When you cry out in your dreams, it is Darkseid that you see. Like, that's that. Again, I'm Jewish, and I'm stealing this from Grant Morrison, who I know a lot of people have mixed feelings on, but he did describe Kirby's dialogue once as Hebraic, and I've always liked that. It's very like, especially in New Gods and Fourth World type stuff, there's a degree of religiosity. I don't know the right word. It feels like you're reading some kind of scripture at times.
Yes.
Is reading scripture always fun? No, because a lot of times scripture is weirdly translated and it's clunky and it doesn't read like poetry, but that doesn't mean there isn't meat in there. You know, that doesn't mean there isn't a lot to find interesting. And, you know, typing out various pieces of dialogue from Jack's comics, the ones that he unambiguously, you know, wrote the dialogue for, over the years has always struck me, because I'll type out some line that he wrote, and once I see it in the context of prose, for some reason it changes it for me, and I'll read it. And for example, I in my book, I quote the Funky Flashman issue of Mr. Miracle pretty extensively.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, extensively. I have a couple of long paragraphs about it, and because obviously it's a pretty central thing if you're going to understand their relationship.
Yeah.
And you know, while I was typing it all out, I was typing out the quotes that Funky says, the dialogue Funky says after he's already thrown Houseroy to the wolves, and you know the old slave plantation is burning down. And I don't have the quote in front of me, but Funky looks at it and just starts waxing poetic about what he's seeing. And he's like, this reminds me of like happy slaves at cotillions, right, having a good time with the masters. And while I was reading, I was like, I had read that issue a couple of times and had missed that he's basically just making this joke about how working for Stan was like, you know, being a slave. You know, and not necessarily he's saying that about himself, but like the idea that you're not really being remunerated for your labor.
Yeah.
It's a really bold and kind of intense thing to depict. Like you're playing with fire there with a set of metaphors and visuals, and it's so much riskier than the stuff that they did together. And you know, I sometimes wonder if no, I don't know. I shouldn't speculate. There's this degree of impulse that you have to try and write fanfic about Stan and Jack that you really have to fight, because there's been a lot of that fanfic written already. Yeah. Like a lot of people have given their interpretations of exactly what happened behind closed doors, and I worked really hard to try to not do that because I wasn't there. I can only tell the stories that other people tell. I mean, I'll spoiler alert that like I didn't find the secret Stan Lee diary entry where he says, "Dear diary, today I ripped off the Fantastic Four from my friend Jack Kirby."
Right.
Well, you know, I apologize, didn't come up with that one. But you know, you get as much as you can, and at the end of the day, you leave it for the reader to kind of, you know, it's so unsatisfying, but like the conclusion that you have to come to a certain extent is we have to not be so certain about things. And I feel like this is something that's hard to accept in politics and in society in general. We don't like ambiguity. But while I was researching the book, what I kept coming up with was there is no evidence that Stan created the various Marvel characters, especially Marvel. Well, let's talk about specifically Fantastic Four. There's no evidence he created Fantastic Four out of his own head before talking to Jack. Does that mean he didn't? I don't know, but there's zero evidence of it other than Stan's own word. And then you have word against it in the form of Jack's words over the years. And it's so freaking irritating that at the end of the day, you just have to go, we don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know. It's really hard to live with that ambiguity, with that duality. And to go, we can't say they were co-creators. You can't say one was definitely the creator, one definitely wasn't. You want to, you really want to. You want to have those sure labels, but like
Resolution.
You want resolution. You want to know that like one person is responsible. And I'm not one of those people who says, well, because one guy said one thing and the other side guy said the other thing, we have to split it down the middle and say they exactly did 50%. Like that's stupid too, in my personal opinion. That's King Solomon splitting the baby, if we're gonna keep being Hebraic and Jewish about it. But you have to live with this ambiguity where, like, I often wonder in my moments of delusions of grandeur, like if this book does take off, I wonder if someone will change the Wikipedia entry for Stan Lee and Jack, whoever, to try and say this is Stan Lee is a person who is credited with being the co-creator of these characters. That's the only thing we can say for certain, is that according to current corporate edicts, he is credited as the co-creator of these characters. That's all we can say with any kind of absolute certainty. Everything else is just people giving in to the impulse to oversimplify and find resolution where there is none. And I hope I'm not ticking off too many people in your audience by not saying like, oh, well, I didn't find specific evidence that like every Kirby diehard's dreams came true. But I don't know. I guess what I'm getting at is I hope that part of the lesson people can get from this book is that life is uncertain, and when it comes to the great Kirby and Lee controversy, there's no exception there. It's really hard to know what happened, and I wish it didn't matter so much. You want this to be a smaller mystery, but like a lot of money is at stake, and a lot of like legal precedent for screwing other people over is at stake in this question, and it kind of is what it is. That's not my conclusion for every other aspect of the book. I just want to emphasize that I do come to a lot of conclusions about things. This is not one of those books where at the end I say, and I didn't learn anything.
I don't know.
What do I know? But on this one question, I am somebody who at the end kind of says you have to live with the fact that we'll never really know.
Yeah.
Anyway, do I have another slide in there? If I do.
I'm wondering. Oh, hello.
And also, my actual favorite Jack Kirby story, of course, has to be Don Rickles meeting Goody Raquel. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that story.
We just reviewed it actually last week.
Did you? Oh, that's great. Yeah. Good timing. Yeah. I remember when Don Rickles died, I was like working on the Fourth World story at the time. And I just said to my editor, like, you've got to let me write a quickie about the Don Rickles issue of, basically Superman, right? I mean, it's Jimmy Olsen, but like the pitch is that time Superman met Don Rickles thanks to Jack Kirby.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I love that story. There's no I don't have any analysis beyond that. I just think oftentimes we underestimate the degree to which Kirby was a good humorist. The jokes are weird.
Yeah, they are.
Issue. They don't really make sense, but at least they're not sort of chintzy, they're not easy gags, which is usually what you see in comics of that era. People were not like doing the most advanced humor outside of like, your Mad Magazine or whatever. So to have this like weird, abstract, like alternate personalities thing with aliens involving Don Rickles and a superhero that looks like Don Rickles is just, it's next level. For somebody like me who like does a lot of medical marijuana, this is the kind of story that you can just give me over and over again. I will always be entertained. I've talked until my throat's been dry. So does anybody want to ask me anything? I don't know how this works.
Has there been any questions
there have been questions.
Yeah, there's been a bunch of questions.
Oh, great.
Okay.
Oh, that was the last
one. Am I going to regret this
or
no. Okay. There's always meeting the public. That's always the scariest part of all of it.
Yeah. You got
we'll start with an easy one. We'll start with a speculative one.
Yeah.
Is it too much to suggest that Stan took a deal for life to be a Marvel ambassador in exchange for taking credit of creation, so the company could claim the IP.
Let me think about how to answer that one. I don't want to. Let's see. Is it too much to suggest Stan took a deal for life to be a Marvel ambassador in exchange? I guess we'd have to talk about what deal for life means. I mean, he had contracts with Marvel.
Yep.
And most of those we don't actually have access to. His 1998 one we do because of various legal proceedings involving that. And if we're talking about at that point, excuse me, in 1998, he signs this document that says, in a way, any kind of right that I might have to anything I created while working at Marvel. That gets complicated because about a month before he'd signed a contract with another company, Stanley Media, that kind of invalidates that contract. It gets very complicated, as is true with every legal involvement involving Stan. But at that point, he did sort of, if you can kind of describe it as a deal for life in the way you're talking about. He did say, I'm not going to try and claim any of this stuff. And then there was an additional lawsuit about the movie and television profits that began in 2002, where Stan sued Marvel for not providing him with what he interpreted as what was supposed to be 10% of the profits for TV and movie products adapted from Marvel things. The Marvel argued that it was profits from the profits. It's like this whole, double percentage thing. But that was a legal proceeding in which, at the end, there was a settlement signed in which Stan kind of signed away his right to that 10% in exchange for a large amount of money. And, it's in that settlement, it's speculated that part of that was him settling with them and getting paid off to say, I'm never going to try and touch these claims of I'm not going to try and take over these characters. I don't know how I would exactly characterize it that way, but if you do read the book, you'll see that there were a lot of instances in which Stan was a good company man, and did what Marvel would have liked him to do. There were ways in which he definitely acted as a global ambassador, certainly. So, you can come to your own conclusions about exactly whether what I'm describing fits that description, but you're in the right ballpark, I would say.
There's another question somewhere about did you interview Jack Kirby? Or Stan Lee, I'm sorry.
Stan, yes and no. I interviewed him via about 6 emailed questions when I wrote that piece I mentioned that was published in 2016, the one that I started writing in 2015 when Stan's graphic memoir adaptation of his previous memoir was coming out. So I reached out through the book publicist and then through Stan's other publicists and various other parties trying to get an actual interview with Stan. And they just gave me the runaround for months. For 6 months, I tried to get an interview with Stan, and they kept sort of saying mañana, mañana, kind of kicking it down the road, and then it never ended up happening, except for I did get to send, I can't remember the exact number, it was 5 to 7 emailed questions that he wrote back. I got answers. I've been told by multiple people that it's likely it actually was Stan writing the answers because he did like replying to mail. He may have dictated it, but it may well have been him getting it, reading it, and then coming up with an answer. Answering mail was a big thing for him. So it may well have been that, but that was the extent of it's not my entire interactions with Stan. There's also in the book, we have this in the photo insert, but I went to Wizard World Chicago, the Chicago Comic-Con of the late 90s in, I believe it was 98, and Stan was doing a signing. And this being the late 90s when the whole comics industry was just going belly up and nothing was going right, and Stan was not doing very well for himself either. there was like barely a line. It's very weird to remember back, but like there was a line, but it wasn't like what you'd see in the later years of Stan's life, where you'd have lines around the block and people getting charged $150. You know, none of that was happening. I just got this. I went to a back issue bin and got some ratty copy of Fantastic Four number 47, which I hadn't even read at that point. Again, because the reprints were hard to find. So I bring 47 up to him after waiting in line for a bit to get it signed. And he signs it, and my mom at the moment, I should add that I'm like, let's see, like 13 when this is happening, 12, 13. She picks up a disposable camera, because it's 1998, you'll remember those. Takes a picture of me and Stan, and that photo is in the photo insert. We included that.
Nice.
And I'm not making this up. I swear. He looks at my mom, he looks at me, and he says, and I'm not going to try to do the voice, but he looks at my mom, he looks at me, and he says, "You've immortalized me." And, you know, I'm not a superstitious guy, but I'm not going to be saying that to anybody anytime soon. Anyway, no. So to answer your question, I did not interview Stan, but I did, you know, more than 150 interviews with other people around him, people who knew him, people who worked with him. I, you know, went through thousands of pages of his personal and professional documents, many of them at the University of Wyoming, where his archives are stored. You know, I watched home movies that were in the archive that, to my knowledge, nobody had seen, or at least had ever written about or reported on. Yeah. You know, I got a pretty close look, but did not actually interview him myself in person.
We have another fun question if you've got the time. We've got a lot of questions, but like it's just whatever you feel like doing. But this is.
Oh, it's Mark Zen Ditko.
Hey.
Of the Marvel, but what one thing would you do to change the future from that point forward? As a historian, I would just ask, you know, Fabulous Flo or whoever was working in, you know, that position to take really copious notes on every meeting that happened and record them surreptitiously if you have to, and provide the future with as much documentation of what was going on as we could ask for.
Maybe you could have brought your iPhone with you and gave it to her back then.
Exactly. See what happens, you know. Want to do a couple more?
If you want to, yeah.
Sure. Yeah, let's do a couple more, and then I'll go drink a glass of water because I feel
Okay.
Did you uncover anything about how Stan felt about
that's a good
Jack
question.
DC?
Yeah, the Atlas Seaboard fracas, you know, affair, whatever. Excuse me. I did have many hours of interview time with Larry Lieber, Stan's brother, and he was very generous with his time and his memories, and that's a real pillar of the book. I mean, there's a lot of the book that would not be there if he had not been willing to speak with me. And so I didn't interview Stan. I only interviewed Larry, but Larry did tell an interesting story about Stan's response to Goodman starting up Atlas Seaboard and trying to poach Larry. I'm hesitant to tell the story because I have to try and move books, and I want to leave you with something to entice you. But I did learn at least what Larry remembers of Stan's response to that. Yes.
Those Atlas books are weird, man.
They are weird.
I haven't even read many of them, but I do. They are strange. Yes.
I was buying them off the racks. It was very strange. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've only read a couple, but they were strange.
Do you have any research material left over that might lend itself to another book? I mean, look, I wish I could say I'll do the Kirby book next, but Evan Neer sort of has a head start on me on that one. And I'd rather let him do that first. I wish I could say I could do a Ditko book, But I'll give it a few years, see if the aforementioned Mark Zenditko, is able to grace the public with more information. But wait, what was the question? Remind me what the question was.
If you have enough material left over for enough research material.
Yes, right. I was like, why am I talking about other books? And then the closest thing would be a book about Peter Paul, who was Stan's business partner at Stanley Media and close friend prior to that. I don't want to get into too much detail, especially because Peter's story does lend itself to another book in that it's very long and I don't have time to go all the way down that road. But I think I even say in the book, like, his life could merit another book. He's a very interesting and unusual personage. Basically he has this life story, or at least claimed life story, that involves Brazilian arsonists and Cuban counter-revolutionaries and, actor Ian McShane and Supreme Court Justice Warren Burger. Like, there's just a lot of Lyndon Johnson, Salvador Dali. Like, his life, or at least the story he tells about his life, is a pretty fascinating journey. And I have no idea if that would ever actually end up being another book, but I bet you could find something in there, or somebody wants to pick up that thread and then run with it.
Well,
Great.
You got another one?
If you don't mind, I think I'm going to sign off. Just
Yeah. Thanks so much, Abe.
Yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Good seeing you.
Was this coherent? I have not been doing many of these interviews yet. Okay.
No, it's great.
Glad to
Can't wait for your book.
Okay, yes, everybody, yes, pre-order AbrahamRiesman.com.
Yep.
AbrahamRiesman.com. You can pre-order the book through there.
Cool.
All right, man.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, we're going to head off and wander over to our farewell with a little bit of a tour of our digital archive. So we'll see you over there. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.